Hello, it's Lois here and welcome back to my studio. Today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this very simple loose landscape. It depicts late summer sunshine over the fields with the fields and crops ripe and ready for harvest. A kind of changing of the seasons really, late summer just with a hint of autumn in the air. I've tried to keep it nice and loose, but still with enough complexity in the different planes of land receding into the distance, achieving this through changing the tonal values from dark to light as I go further back into the landscape. The first thing I did was to draw out my landscape very lightly in pencil, just putting in the position of the horizon line, the distant land, the midground and the foreground, and of course putting in different layers of trees so that we get that depth and distance. And just a reminder that my book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner, is now available to purchase from all good online bookstores. I shall leave a couple of Amazon links in the description below if you're interested in taking a look. So let's get on with today's demo. I'm going to be using the wet in wet method to start with, and I'm using Saunders Waterford cold press watercolour paper. It's taped to my board with ordinary decorator's masking tape, and my paper isn't pre-stretched. It will buckle a little bit as I paint, but then as it dries it will flatten out. My board's at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees, and I'm going to paint the sky wet in wet to start with. And I'm just going to wet the sky with my large wash brush. This is a Princeton Aqua Elite Mottler brush, 1.5 inches, but any large wash brush that you're comfortable with will do. I'm sort of using this wetting time to practice the sky. So what I did was left areas of the paper dry and just painted the water in where I wanted my sky, leaving the unpainted areas for clouds. And now I can see those damp areas, and I can go in with my cobalt blue and the same brush, and I can just sort of bring that blue across around the dry areas of paper, touching into some of the wet areas and dry areas too, so I get these lovely soft diffusions. I'm not worried if it looks a little bit patchy, because I'm fairly confident from practice and experience that this should dry okay. I think it's better off to have a sky that kind of looks really simple like this than to have one that begins to look muddy and overworked. So just put just enough brush strokes into it. Soften back maybe with a clean damp brush if there's any hard edges, and then step back and leave it alone. Now I'm going to wet the foreground area. I'm going to leave the midground and the distance for a little while, but I'm going to put the foreground field in first while the sky is drying. This is going to be a mixture of raw sienna and raw umber. Towards the back of the field, it's going to be mostly raw sienna, and across the front of the field, right in the foreground, where I want to sort of give the indication of my upright crop of wheat, I'm using raw umber along with the raw sienna to give me that sort of lovely golden brown. And once I'm happy with that and my sky is just about dry, using the tips of the brush and a very pale value of raw sienna for the most distant plane of land, and then just below that I shall use sap green and put in the next plane of land, keeping it nice and narrow. And then below that, another field full of crop, which is going to hopefully dry back slightly lighter than our foreground field once I've finished with it. Just before everything dries completely, this is a nice rich consistency, deep summer green, mixed from sap green and perylene green. And I'm using my round brush, it's a size 14 Escoda Perla brush, to just get in my tree canopies first. Starting off with this lovely deep summer green in the foreground, and then I shall still keep the green nice and dark as I paint in the trees in the midground and further back, but I shall allow the paint to run out a bit on the brush so that these trees should dry slightly lighter. And then with the use of the paler colours as we go back and less detail, then that should hopefully end up giving us some aerial perspective. Maybe just dab off with a tissue if things go on a little bit dark. And remember that, of course, watercolour will dry back 20 to 30% lighter. We may have to go in and darken some of these areas again. But this is quite easy to do because I put my road map in, my penciled sketch at the beginning. So I know exactly where I need to paint my trees, and I can paint them in really quickly with the minimum of brush strokes. And of course, using minimal brush strokes is what will keep the painting looking nice and loose. I'll just finally put in a few trunks. Joining some of the branches through the gaps in the canopies, although some of those might get covered when I come to put my darker shadow in a bit later. Using my number 2 rigger brush. And then finally just putting in extra dark just at the base of these midground trees and my foreground tree with Peroline green and Payne's grey. Just putting that really deep shadows that's so typical of summer trees that are in full leaf. And that's the first layer done. I now need to leave it to dry completely and come back and then finish the painting. So here's the dry painting, and we've got our lovely softly diffused sky and beginning to build up the plains of land. I now want to paint in the very distant row of trees and little single trees. For this I'm using my small calligraphy brush. This is an unbranded brush that I found on eBay. Any small brush that's got a good point or that you can use just dragging the side of it along to just create the illusion of distant trees on the horizon and a few odd little single trees. I'm using the same colour that I was using before, but it's quite a watery mixture and has a little bit of cobalt blue added to it. And it makes it quite a pale value. Even though it's still dark, it's a much paler greyer, undesaturated colour, if you like. And this gives us a sense of aerial perspective. Just putting in a few little single trees there, and then I shall continue that row of trees, making sure that I get the illusion of the distant trees still continuing behind and beyond the foreground trees, and then out of the picture plane. And then adding a bit of a hedgerow here, just a short distance down from that bank of trees on the left. But that gives us the suggestion of being quite a lot of real distance between that hedgerow and the trees a bit further back by leaving that thin strip of field there. Just trying to get the indication of sort of a hedge, maybe a few little hints of fence posts using the tip of the brush. Just put in a bit of extra shadow just at the base of these trees. If I darken that tree up a little bit more, it's using my artistic license to create contrast between that tree and the very greyed out tree line in the distance. and I hope you'll see how that suddenly gave the picture a lot more depth and distance. This is sap green, bit of perylene green and a bit of cobalt blue, and I'm just filling in that gap there for a nice verdant green field. Darkening it up on the left. That will just soften and diffuse. I can soften up the base of that once I've got the colour all the way across. I can just soften it up with a clean damp brush so that the edge where the green meets the foreground field is a much softer edge. And I hope you can see that by building up all these separate planes of land carefully but keeping them quite narrow, we've created quite a bit of depth and distance. I'm just going to put a bit more of this raw sienna in the far distance, but that's a little bit too bright, so using the brush just damp, I'm pulling out a bit of that paint, and you can see now that by keeping it nice and pale there but still adding a little bit more colour, we do have a nice illusion of distance. Strengthening up those tree trunks, and I can continue with my number 2 rigger brush to put in tree trunks for these trees that are a little bit further back, and where the dark trees contrast against the paler field, it stands out quite nicely. And again, all these trees that are staggered at different sizes and different distances throughout the landscape is what helps to give us this sense of distance. Just a few little dots and hints of fence posts. And then I can take my palette knife and just carefully scrape through to bring back the fence that I penciled in on this field boundary in the middle ground. And now, still with that dark colour, a fine horizontal line of shadow underneath that group of trees. And the same for those, keeping it very faint, so it's just a hint of that perceived shadow. There's a bit of darker paint underneath to darken up the base of that group of trees. And then with my dark green, I'm just going to add just a little bit of detail around the edge of some of these closer trees. A little bit of darkness as well, but it's just to break up the edge here and there. Making sure I don't overdo this effect. I want it just to be just quite subtle. So these small finishing touches are sort of just a bit of a balancing act at the end of the painting. A bit more shadow. And now I think I'm just about finished, but I think I just want to get some texture using the fan brush and raw sienna and raw umber across the foreground field. And the fan brush will give me these sort of vertical strokes if I'm careful not to overdo it and use quite a dry mixture of paint. And that will just give me the shape of the wheat crop or whatever it is in the foreground. But I'm only going to put that texture in right in the foreground, because once I've put that in, then the rest of the crop will be sort of implied by that little bit of detail in the foreground. just darkening up the sides of some of the fence posts, and then put some horizontal wires across to join them. Making sure the fence posts get closer together as they go into the distance. Trying to keep it really loose. And I'm going to call that finished. I'm going to remove the tape now and see how it looks with its clean white border. And when we see it with the tape off and lose all those sort of brush strokes that go off across the tape, then it looks a lot neater and looks a lot more finished. And I'm happy with the way that this has turned out. I'm pleased with the way the depth and distance has worked, and we've got the illusion of quite a lot of different fields and trees stretching right back into the distance. So I think what's important to take from this demo is that if you want to create depth and distance, you have to consider the positioning of your elements in the landscape. In this demo, it was fields and trees, and they've all been positioned in order to create that sense of recession and aerial perspective. So by more sort of warmer colours, stronger, more contrast and detail in the foreground, and then cooler colours and less detail in the background, then things will naturally recede. So don't forget to check out the link below for my new book if you're interested in watercolour landscape painting, and also check out our Patreon links if you'd like to support the channel, and thank you to everybody that does. So I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.